Okay. We're studying storm surge attenuation in Chesapeake Bay and as a research group, and I'm going to do this as a kind of a process-oriented presentation as opposed to more technical. I just want to give you an idea of what we're doing and how we're doing it and why we're doing it. So we're interested in storm surge, and in particular in wetlands. So just to give you a refresher on what happens, a storm comes, whether it's a hurricane or a nor'easter, and it pushes water in like a column, and as over time that water column gets bigger and bigger until it makes landfall, and then it's slowed by a house or a slope on the land or whatever it is, and that is storm surge. That's a combination of two things. It's a combination of the water column that's being pushed, you can see it right here, from the storm, and then on top of that are waves that are going up and down. And it's devastating to coasts throughout the world, in particular on the East Coast. We have hurricanes every year, and we have nor'easters. So we have a lot of issues with storm surge. What makes storm surge big or small, if you will, are the parameters of the storm, what we call forcing, which is the hurricane track. So if New York is here and the hurricane comes here, the surge might be light. But if the storm comes this way, the track is closer to where your point of interest is, the surge will be greater. Radius of storm, which is how big it is, central pressure, forward speed, and the angle with which it hits. Because remember, a hurricane is spinning this way. So the winds are going this way, and the water will end up having some of this trajectory. So the angle of approach matters for storm surge. Just a little background, the Army Corps of Engineers looked into it in the early part of the 19th century and published a report in the 60s where they wanted to just have like an idea. If a surge comes, a hurricane hits, and it encounters a marsh, how will the marsh dampen that surge or attenuate it? And what they said is, we're going to make a rule of thumb which says for every 2.5 kilometers of marsh, the surge will be reduced by 1 meter. Right? So at the edge of the marsh, if the surge is 4 meters, 2.5 kilometers in, it'll be down to 3, etc. This has not been a very good rule of thumb, and there's been a lot of recent attention on it. And here we see the scatter. They did a study, a statistical analysis of the data that the Army Corps used, and they found that in some scenarios it would be a meter reduction for 60 kilometers, and in other cases a meter for 5 kilometers, which is all to say this is not a good metric. It's not even a really rule of thumb that you can use. We're interested in the small part here, the marshland bridge. All along the East Coast we have barrier islands, that you see number 2 there, and in some cases we have from barrier island directly to marsh, in some cases we have barrier island to lagoon or sound, and then marsh. We're studying specifically the marshland bridge, which looks small here, but can be kilometers, along the eastern seaboard. This is a picture of one of our study sites, and you can see this is a channel here that runs up. This is the beginning of a barrier island, and this is the land-sea interface. And you can see what's going on right here. The waves are coming, they're meeting the vegetation, resistance causes turbulence, and the energy is lost. And so what we want to do is quantify that interaction, right? Particularly with the storm. Now here you can see it's immediately killing it, right? And it's the level of vegetation to the water surface is pretty impactful on what's going on. But if the water surface is, a meter above the grass, well, the friction is much less impacted. So the objectives are to improve our understanding of storm surge flow over wetland ecosystems, and in particular ecosystems along the eastern seaboard. And we are trying to do this in 2 parts. We're doing field work where we look at, okay, we've identified some wetland areas. We want to characterize the vegetation that is in those areas that causes the friction, and we're going to monitor water levels, hoping kind of for a storm to come through so that we can get good data on how the vegetation and the water interaction takes place. And in the future we may look at microtopography, which is a small variance in the topography of the marsh itself and how that slows the surge. The second component is high performance computing. So we're doing simulations using a computer model of surge in different scenarios, going over these same areas that we have incorporated into the model. I'll talk about. Okay, so I'll talk about the field work first. These are some interns that came over the summer and did a topographic survey, or at the beginning of one anyway, at one of our study sites, and this is the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel you can see here. So this is right on the tip of the Delmarva Peninsula. So the first thing to do for the vegetation, which we haven't done yet but is planned for next summer, is characterize the vegetation. And one of the properties we need to characterize is frontal area. So when surge comes, it's going to hit this frontal area, and we need to know how much that is. And in this part of the marsh, it's fairly uniform, but that's not the case over all the marshes. So we have to find a way to characterize it for both modeling and reporting. Biomechanical properties of the grass is important. So if this is the land and the grass goes from here to here, let's say it's 1/2 of a meter. When the water hits it here, there's very little flexibility, depending on how rigid the grass is. As it gets up here, well, we've got a moment now, and it'll start to give, and it gets up over here, the grass will bend over. So we need to know how rigid the grass is, or the vegetation. And it can be anything from something that's not very rigid at all, to a pine tree, which isn't going to move, or a mangrove. And then seasonal variation. You can see here, it's beautiful green codgrass, and here's completely dormant and brown. So there's a difference in the way the interaction between the water or the surge is going to be, depending on when it interacts with the vegetation. A series of lab studies were done, and you can see here, this is the same vegetation type that we have, and they've done experiments over a bunch of different simulations. Here where I was talking about where the water is at the very top of the grass, here where it's a little lower down, and then they've done dormant modeling, where for this study they actually planted the grass in the flume. It's a big flume, and it's the real grass. And up here they did some rigid vegetation when they took plastic, cylinders and made it look like the grass and respond like it for rigidity purposes. We have 3 monitoring sites up and going now, and we'll probably change them or add new ones. But so here we are up here somewhere. We've got one here on the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. It's called EWRE Marsh. It's a protected area, so there's no human interaction there. No one can be on the marsh. Mogothie Bay and Eastern Shore, and these are kind of right on top of each other at the tip of the Delmarva. You can see we have this next slide show up, but we're interested in this section here, that section, and up here we're kind of interested right here at this cross section. Eastern Shore of Virginia is the first site that we chose. We put sensors in the marsh, one right here in the water to monitor astronomical tide. And then we put them in along the marsh. And it looks pretty small here, but when you walk through the marsh to actually put the sensors in, it takes a couple of hours by the time you get there, check on the sensors, get the data, and replace them. And the lines, a little difficult to see here, but you can see these are topo lines, and they're 1 meter apart. So there's almost no variation. This is a meter and that's a meter, so maybe 2 meters over whatever that is, 600 or 400 meters. And that's what we want, right? We want a plain surface with the vegetation. The water comes over. We can isolate the interaction between the vegetation and the water. There's another site just north of that. It's Mogothie Bay Natural Area Preserve, and once again, these are where we have water level sensors. And they're recording every 6 minutes. And often they're recording nothing, right? This guy here is not going to be inundated unless there's a storm. So he's reading 0 all the time. Whereas this guy out here is constantly recording the tide levels. EWRE Marsh is our 3rd site, and you can see it's only about 200 meters across. And what we're seeing preliminarily is, if this guy gets wet, if a storm pushes water here, it also gets to here. So we're thinking that the spatial scale is too small. By the time it's there, it's already over there at the 2nd sensor. For instrumentation, we're using what we call hobo sensors. It's a manufacturer, and what they do is they measure pressure So we put one of these sensors up in a tree, and that measures atmospheric pressure. And then we put the others either in the water or in the marsh, and then we take the difference in the pressure reading, and then we calculate what the water level is at each sensor. This is just a look at the preliminary data. So sensor number 1 is the one in the water, and that's going to be measuring water almost all the time. You can see it misses low tide, so this is where low tide is. So when low tide comes, the water sensor is just above the low tide mark. And this is a storm, and you can see this little blip right here, and this one is the sensor that is furthest away from the shore, deepest into the marsh, and during this storm, there was some inundation there. In a hurricane scenario, they would all be considerably higher. And this is just kind of a look at how the marsh reacts just to a flood event. This is not a major storm here, but you can see this is a low tide, and this is what will be a high tide. But already a lot of water is spilling over into the marsh, which raises the question about the drag, right? If there's no water in the marsh and a storm surge comes, it's going to encounter a different frictional resistance from the vegetation than if the marsh is already inundated. So the next thing we have to do is very precisely fix a vertical datum to each one of our monitoring sites so that we can calculate the relative water levels at each spot. And then evaluate different rate loss to see if we can find a good agreement between the friction that we're encountering and the water as it propagates through the marsh. So that's the field work. The second part is computer modeling, and we are using AdCirc and SWAN. They're two different models. AdCirc does tides and surge, and SWAN does waves. So we're modeling this surge with a coupled version where AdCirc goes through the model, which is a grid, a map, if you will, and it goes point by point, figures out what the tide is, what the surge is, and then talks to SWAN, which goes ahead and puts a wave on top of that, on that water level value. Now this is a computer model that's done in a Linux environment and high performance computing, so we have an allocation with Stampede, which is a supercomputer, and we do the simulations on there. And it's really not an easy process, for lack of a better way of putting it. The data files are really big. The input files are sometimes 1 gigabyte or 2 gigabytes, and some of the output files, and there may be 10, will be 25 gigabytes each. So just opening the files can be difficult. And then the other thing that slows down or increases computing time is the resolution of the mess. The more points you have, the more calculations you need to have, and the slower the computing process is. So for a typical run that we're doing, which is a high-cast of Hurricane Isabel, we'll use 600 cores, and it will take 15 hours using all of those to complete the simulation, or 9,000 hours. So it takes a long time. To set up the model, we started with the FEMA Region 3 grid, which is, it's a triangular network, and there's each point on that grid has an XY location and a Z value. So it's topography and bathymetry. We started with this mesh, and then we increased resolution in certain areas that we're interested in to look at both sensitivity and get a better idea of what's going on. So this is, to run the model, the first thing we have is the grid, right, which is the X, Y, Z. Now each point on that grid, we give values to it. So we let it know if there's water there, or if there's a tree there, or if there's grass, so that when the hurricane comes through, the correct amount of friction is applied to the water there. And that friction can be like a Manning's N, but it can also be wind, because wind is forcing the water, the surge, and if the wind hits a huge landfall of trees or buildings, it slows the wind, and therefore slows the oncoming water. So we have to do that, and just to give you an idea of how big these files are, this has over 5 million lines. So we have trouble even opening and closing the files. And then for the model setup, we use forcing, and we've done a couple of things. One, we use data from the National Weather Center, which is recorded time series of the track, the speed, the angle, and the pressure of a hurricane, and then we put that back in. It's called hindcasting. Another is we make up storms, and what we've been doing is using recorded storms like Isabel or Floyd, and then modifying them a little bit. And this one you can see what Mitune's done is he's taken Hurricane Isabel, which came in a little bit south of our areas, and had to make a little bit more of a direct hit to see how that changes the surge in our areas. Let me see if this will run. Probably won't.
You have to continue to exit out of escape mode.
So this is a very small light version of simulation results from one of these models. What you're seeing here is the central pressure as it propagates through, and the red arrows around the bays are velocities, water velocities coming in. You can see they're coming in and coming out. That's your tidal movement of water. And as the central pressure in the hurricane gets close to the shore, you can see those big red areas are velocity vectors of the water, increasing as the surge comes through. So that's it.
This was Isabel, you said, or modified?
That was Isabel.
Not modified.
And then we want to validate it, right? We want to make sure that what the model spits out is accurate. And so these are plots of 2 NOAA stations that recorded actual water levels during Hurricane Isabel. And the blue is the recorded water level at that time. And so as you see green, red, and black up there. They're all exactly over top of each other. We did 3 different simulations. We didn't change anything in this area, and that's why there's no difference in those. But you can see that the surge is very close to, the peak surge is very close to the actual recorded value of NOAA, and our tides are very close to what happened. So we're pleased with the way the model is responding, and the next step is to start doing a sensitivity analysis. So this is one of our areas. What we did was we took that grid that I showed you and we turned it into a topographical map or rendering. And here's the original resolution from the FEMA map. This is a channel, and then this is the land, and this is a barrier island. Mitune put a bunch more nodes in this area, increased resolution of 50 meters, and you can start to see a little bit more of the actual features. And then we did it again, and here you can clearly see this is much more consistent with what is actually on the ground. You can see channelization in this barrier island and in the marshes, and you can just see the relief as it changes. So this is a 10-meter mesh, and this added, I don't know, maybe 150,000 nodes, something like that, to the mesh. And then we did a sensitivity analysis for friction. So what we're trying to do is, the model uses Manning's N to develop a drag coefficient, but what that's trying to do is evaluate how much friction is actually being encountered as the surge propagates through the marsh. And the way we do this is, at each node point, we say, okay, this is the friction value, and this is just the Manning's N. As I mentioned, there are many different parameters for friction, but the Manning's N is what we're looking at. So we took this area, and over here we see the original values. The green, that's all green because that's water. And the Manning's N we're using is 0.02, which is sandy bottom. And you can see the different colors here correspond to values from the National Land Cover Database. We took the National Land Cover Database value, we changed it to Manning's N value, we put in the model. So then to test the model for sensitivity, we changed the areas in the regions that we're interested in to a consistent value. So, okay, let's say they're all sandy bottom. Or let's say the friction is equivalent to all pine forest or brush. Right? So we vary the friction parameters at each area. And these are the results. So this is a marsh along the Atlantic eastern coast, I guess the Atlantic coast. And we have a recording station here in the model, here at each point, and these points are about 500 meters apart. So here at this station in the water, all three runs where we change friction inland are the same. And that's what we want, right? The friction in the water is minimal, and so all three models correspond. Where we want to see departure is as we go inland, because the first model run, where it says NLCD, is the actual land cover from the National Land Cover Data Set. That's the friction value. And the second one low is we said, okay, let's take that value and say that there is no friction there. In the third one, we increase friction. And you can see in the results, there's very little difference between the land cover database friction value and what we said is low friction. But we can see the surge attenuation here where the high friction value came in. So just to make sure that's clear, high friction means the water's being slowed. So if you have high friction, you should see lower water levels, and you're seeing lower peak surge, right? 22 meters. And then further inland, so this one is 1266, and this one, you can see they correspond up there. Now we're seeing, not only are we seeing less surge, right? There's this much difference in surge because of the friction resistance, but it's actually inundating later. So it's taking longer for the water to get further inland because it's encountering more friction as it travels through the marsh. So we're in the middle of this analysis, and we're running different scenarios to get a real good feeling of how AdCirc and SWAN are sensitive to friction parameterization. So the next steps are to continue analyzing this data and figuring out how sensitive the model is, how accurate do we think it is with actual values on the ground, and ultimately, I should have mentioned this at the beginning perhaps, engineering solutions for coastal protection, there is a bit of a movement now to get away from putting hard barriers. If you put a huge seawall, let's say, that's excellent for preventing surge, but it can be devastating to ecosystems, as particularly in a bay area or an estuarine area where fish come in and spawn, and there's just a lot of productivity in those areas that can be damaged by putting up a hard surface. So the idea is, well, maybe all these marshes could be reconstituted or built that would have positive results at an ecosystem level and also slow the propagation of surge or serve as a coastal defense. And that's the ultimate goal, is to be able to say, okay, you want to protect this area, New York City, maybe build a mile of marsh. Probably not realistic, but the idea is to be able to quantify that and put that tool in the hands of people that are making decisions on coastal defense. That's what I got.